a LitHub Radio podcast.
Hello, writers. I'm here to tell you some good news. Memoir Nation, the new writing endeavor that Brooke and I have been working on for a year now, is now live. And you know, so many people, I've heard this over the years, they say, I'm going to write my story someday. But someday tends to kind of always be off in the distance. And we're here to help you start writing your story today. We're providing the inspiration, the guidance, the structure, and support to equip you creatively, emotionally, and psychologically, and perhaps more to write your life story. And there are several packages of support and inspiration that you can sign up for, but I'm going to spotlight one for you now as a listener to our podcast. Out of the gate, the $99 level of membership is going to give you a lot of perks, including a weekly newsletter with lots of memoir insights and tips and advice and encouragement. And it will also get you the bonus podcast content and a code for a free future class of your choosing. So it's a really good deal for $99, but also important to us is that it's support we need to launch this thing, get it off the ground, make it sustainable. And if you've been a longtime listener and you like the content you get on this show, there's going to be a lot more growth and exciting things in the weeks and months and years to come. So we invite you to join us at this $99 subscriber level. Check out the other levels, though. They might be better for you. You know, we've done this podcast for more than 6 years now, and we've actually done it entirely for free and as a labor of love, and we do love it, but we'd also love your support as we expand the ways we help writers tell their stories. So we'll make it worth your while, we promise, and we thank you in advance for supporting us to create the space we're dreaming of for writers like you. Visit memoirnation.com.
Hello, permission seekers, permission getters, and permission tossers. Welcome to this next installment of Memoir Nation. We are so happy to have you. I'm Brooke Warner, and I'm here with Grant Faulkner, as always, and we're barreling right along with this rebranding thing, Grant, and I think it's been pretty seamless. What do you think?
Yeah, I'm a proud member of Memoir Nation, Brooke, who occasionally says, welcome to Right-Minded. I mean, Memoir Nation. But yeah, other than linguistic lapses, I feel like I'm in a wonderful new land, and I'm super inspired and charged up by Memoir Nation.
Yeah, me too. And I know we did have a few listeners lament that we wouldn't be focusing on fiction anymore, but the reality is that memoir does blur into any kind of storytelling, and fiction certainly is driven by what we know. So I'm just saying, for those of you who are missing the fiction part, that there is plenty still here for you, and writing is writing. And yet there's an aspect of memoir writing that's quite unique to memoir writing, Grant, and we're diving headlong into that today, and that is shame. It's fear. Because it's different with memoir. Fiction does give you that proverbial veil, you know, that protection to hide behind, even if you're writing something deeply, deeply personal, but memoir doesn't. And most memoirists describe publishing their memoirs as walking out into the world naked. And that's pretty much the stuff of nightmares. And yet memoirists subject themselves to that because it matters so much, clearly, because there's something so compelling and ultimately healing about doing so. And Grant, I'm curious to know, did you ever feel shame when you wrote fiction?
Did I personally? I maybe did. I'm going to think about this because I think fiction writers deal with a type of shame and embarrassment that's similar to what memoir writers deal with, but they do have that shield of fiction, like you say, which definitely helps. But that said, you know, I think it's, and this is like where I think shame comes in. For me personally, it's easy as a fiction writer to project shame. And what I mean by that is that readers so often misread things in stories. They read them as the author's experiences when they're not, you know, that they're presented as fiction and they are fiction. And so I've had readers ask me if some things in my stories happened to me personally, almost as if I haven't made up the story or imagined it. And I think that that's the wrong way to read fiction, to read it in order to find out what's true in the author's life. But then it's also human nature to do that. And I do that from time to time as well. I think we're just kind of oriented towards gossip, perhaps. But then there are those times when you're writing about your own life to some degree on the page, and it's easy to feel a sense of exposure when you do that, even in fiction. And I tend to think that all art is confession on some level. So there can be possible feelings of shame in that, you know. For me personally, I believe that the best writing risks being vulnerable. And since I grew up in a culture that was essentially built around being closed and invulnerable, I always experience a vulnerability hangover of some sort. And I will wonder if I've been too vulnerable on the page.
All right. Well, thank you. You've sort of recast my feelings then about shame in fiction. What about your memoir in progress? How has shame come up there for you, assuming it has a little bit?
Yeah, I think I'm going to recast the word shame because I don't relate to it so much. I think for me, embarrassment might be the better word, or vulnerability. Since embarrassment and shame are often used interchangeably, just want to kind of clarify their meanings, because embarrassment is a temporary feeling of discomfort or self-consciousness, which is, triggered by social situations where you feel exposed. And then shame is more about a deeper feeling of personal inadequacy or worthlessness because you've done something kind of morally reprehensible. So I think what I feel in my memoir is more of a tangle of things when I write, and they mainly revolve around the question of exposure and revelation, if I want or need to be as vulnerable or as open on the page, and what that might mean to those I'm also writing about, and then what I want to leave for my kids to read, So that's kind of the tangle there. It has less to do about shame or something that I've done that's morally reprehensible, but more about embarrassment or the act of revelation. And I know you're grappling with the latter as well, Brooke, and it's been interesting for me as my kids get older, now that they're both young adults, we're essentially becoming more and more like peers. And I've certainly opened up to them to tell them, I guess what you might call my shameful moments. I recently told my son about several drinking episodes when I was younger, when I blacked out. And then I've told them about my history of suicidal ideation, which has been with me since I was a kid, in the hopes that we can talk more openly about, any mental health or drinking problems we might be having. And mental health issues tend to still be stigmatized. I don't think of them as shameful per se, but I think people can internalize a kind of cultural shame. So they can be a source of shame. So, but how about you, Brooke? I know that writing your memoirs brought up different types of questions and issues. So has shame come up for you?
Yeah, I do appreciate all that you're saying. Thanks for sharing all of that. And I also want to add on to this thing, because when you're saying, shame is something that you've done that's morally reprehensible, I think what's important to also qualify for people, just because I work with so many survivors, is that shame is also carried by people when morally reprehensible things have been done to them.
Mm-hmm.
And I think that's really, really important, because it's not ours to carry, but we do. And that hasn't come up for me in my work. I'm actually, not a survivor, although I'm adjacent to a survivor because my ex is a survivor, but it's a subject matter that is full of shame. I mean, there's other things that come up for me on my own side. I mean, my sexual identity, which I don't feel shame about, but I've had to grapple with feelings around that, just especially within my own family. Falling in love with my first wife was attached to some shame for me because it was an affair and she was my boss, and then we had the fallout of her marriage, her subsequent mental health issues. So there's just a lot of stuff, you're talking about stigma, certainly, and you're kind of grappling with all of that stuff and what's yours to tell. All of it is like really, really tough. And I think that you come right up against like walls of shame, but also with this whole subject matter that we're covering today, because we have on guest Elissa Altman, who's written this book called Permission. And so I'm just like really happy to tackle this, because I've certainly grappled with my own questions of permission in writing my own story.
Yeah, permission is a big, juicy topic here. And Brooke, before we bring Elissa on, let's give a little bit of an overview of what the book is, because it's memoir plus or prescriptive memoir or hybrid, one of those words, all of those words. And it's definitely got memoir in it also, but it's a book that explicitly seeks to give writers permission, which is why it's so important, I think. Mm-hmm. So tell us a bit about your impressions.
Yeah, the big central story of this book, and I'm not giving anything away here because Elissa has talked about this in interviews already, and it's in the introduction of her book, but it's this shameful thing that happened in her family when her grandmother walked out on her family, her paternal grandmother. So again, not something that anyone in the family did, but the grandmother did this, and then it has this reverberating shame through the generations. And she was gone for 3 years. And not surprisingly, this became a core trauma for her father, who was a toddler when she left. And then he passed this fear of abandonment on to Elissa, who really grew up in abject terror that either of her parents might just not be there one day. And then fast forward, she wrote about this story in her first memoir, and her family, notably her father's sister and her kids, so those would be Elissa's cousins, disowned her. They were pissed, and they said it wasn't hers to tell. Honestly, Grant, I think this is every memoirist's worst nightmare. And I have heard people really grappling with whether they'll be able to publish their memoir, just because they're afraid that something like this could happen to them.
I know. It's the funniest thing. You have to write it to have that fear sometimes.
Right.
In Elissa's case, it was too late. The book was published. There was no undoing it. And then they just cut her out of their lives. And what precedes for Elissa is some of the hardest years of her life, where she's left to reckon with big questions of permission and what was hers to tell and not tell. And also, I think, interestingly, the fact that for her, this wasn't really a secret because her father had always openly talked about it, whereas her aunt had not. And so for her children, it was this deeply buried and shameful thing, which also shows that we all interpret our family stories differently, which can make a memoir a bit of a minefield, definitely.
Oh my gosh, isn't that true? And it can be really hard to know, if you're not totally in sync with your family members, what's okay, what's not okay. And then you have to deal with this question of whether you'll go ahead and write and publish it anyway, because it matters to you. And I have more than a few authors who have contended with potential estrangement of family members who did not want them to publish their memoirs. Usually it's siblings. In one case, it was a son, and it's really, really painful. And over the years, I'd say I had this conversation with maybe 9 or 10 authors. Only one chose not to move forward, and only in one case did the book being published actually lead to full-blown estrangement. But to suffice it to say, Grant, the risk is real, and this is a super important conversation and a really great topic for a book.
Completely, yeah. Great topic for Memoir Nation as well. We'll have to ask Elissa to teach a class for us because this is so pervasive, such a dominant topic on people's minds, and seemingly something that most, if not all, memoirists deal with, in which, because it's an emotional topic and not related to craft, probably doesn't get the kind of attention it's due. And memoirists have to try to navigate these muddy waters on their own, which is pretty treacherous, really. So thankfully, we have Elissa Altman on the show today to wade into these muddy waters with, and I'm excited and grateful for that. And we'll be right here while you get your waders on. Take your time. We're waiting.
Welcome back, everyone. Today's guest is Elissa Altman. Elissa is the author of Permission, the new memoirist and the courage to create, and the critically acclaimed award-winning author of 3 memoirs, Motherland, Trafe, and Poor Man's Feast. Altman's work has appeared everywhere from Bitter Southerner and Orion to The Guardian, Narrative, Oprah Magazine, and Krista Tippett's On Being, among many, many other places. Elissa is very widely published. She also has a very acclaimed Substack called Poor Man's Feast, and she's a James Beard Award winner for narrative food writing and a finalist for the 2020 Lambda Literary Award in memoir. She also teaches the craft of memoir. In other words, Elissa, you're my soul sister. Welcome.
Thank you so much for having me, Brooke. It's great to meet you.
Yeah, you too. It's about time, honestly. So Permission is a deeply personal book where, in addition to unpacking a lot of specific advice and ideas and encouragement for would-be memoirists, probably also and memoirists who have already published books, you're doing all these things. You're giving permission to write, but you also tell this story that ended up being the catalyst for this book, which is about really betraying your family when you didn't even realize you were betraying them.
Right.
And we offered up the broad strokes of your story before you came on. So more than an overview of what happened, I'm curious to know how you overcame the shock and anguish to continue to write, and then specifically how that rift led you to write this book.
Yeah, thank you. That's a great question. It's taken me a long time. I mean, I should really be clear about that. When the book came out and the quote unquote betrayal happened, it was 2013. And I was just starting to write my second memoir, Trafe. And, I was second guessing myself all over the place. I would say probably for those first 3 years, I was, to say I was creatively kind of paralyzed would be an understatement. I mean, it was, I have no siblings. I have a very small family. And so we were all very, very tight. And to write something that I did not know was going to result in this. I mean, it was a secret that I did not know was a secret. It was devastating. It took a long, long time. And, but like probably every writer I've ever known, my way of working through it, of metabolizing it, was to write about it, and to write, whether it was in my journal or it was an essay. The first time I ever talked about this was in 2016 when I wrote an essay for Krista Tippett's On Being, and it was one of those situations that every writer, if they are blessed, we have this thing that happens where we sit down at our desk or at our computer and this thing falls out of us. It just like runs right out of us. And so I wrote this essay that was basically about story ownership, and when do we get to own our stories and how does that happen? So that came out in 2006. And then that was like igniting, and igniting the blaze. And I wrote something for the Rumpus shortly thereafter. And at that point, that was around 2017, I was back in it up to my neck, and I had to address the questions of, what happens? This happens to every memoirist to one degree or another, and not even memoirists. I mean, it happens to writers of poetry who I've spoken to. It happened to a very well-known novelist who showed up in one of my workshops, scared the daylights out of me when she showed up in my workshop, but that's a whole other story. Wonderful person. And it's everywhere. So the issues of permission and story ownership, it became very clear to me that they were the elephant in the room.
On Sari Botton's Memoirland, you described permission as a mix of masterclass and memoir. And in one of your bios, the book is referred to as a hybrid memoir. And of course, there's Memoir Plus nowadays too. And so I'm curious, as a memoir teacher, what do you make of these distinctions? And what was it like to write a blended genre memoir after having written and published 3 other, what I guess we'd call standard memoirs?
I have a history as a publisher and an editor, a trade book editor, for many, many years. And so I am acutely attuned to the categories and the genres and the subgenres, because I remember the days that, sitting in the marketing meetings and saying, okay, where are we going to put, the shelf test? Where is this going to be shelved? Right. And so I think that those changes are ongoing. And as long as there are people writing, and as long as there are writers kicking down the walls of genre, those new sort of delineations are going to occur. And whether it's autofiction, I just was teaching a workshop a couple of weeks ago where everybody wanted to know about autofiction. And I was like, well, okay, this is going to be a very long conversation. In terms of permission, I did not set out to write a hybrid memoir. I mean, that's what we've been calling it. That's what I've been calling it. I set out to write a book that was really a craft book. And I thought it was going to be really straightforward, And as I was writing it, I realized I was probably 18 months into it. I was out at a residency in Texas, and I realized that I could not write this book without wrapping it in context. And I had to be really clear and really, absolutely transparent with my readers and my students about this thing that had happened to me, and to talk about the cautionary tale part of it, as well as the, I don't want to say prescription because it's not super prescriptive, but it is kind of an open-ended look at, these are the things that may happen. These are the things that you as a writer will have to deal with. You as a memoirist will have to deal with, whether or not you are a new memoirist and you're sitting down for the first time to write, or you're entering a workshop for the first time, because lots of things, you probably know this, but lots of things come out in workshops. This is generally the way it happens, almost organically. And so whether you're at the earliest stages or you are at a much more experienced, multi memoirist stage the way I am now. I mean, I'm just going back into starting some new work now and finally sort of thinking about it. And it's important that that memoirists consider all of these things, but they also consider them from the point of view of someone who went through what I think was the unthinkable. I mean, what happened to me does not happen to everyone. So please do not be terrified. Please do. It's terrifying enough.
Right.
It's terrifying. Writing memoir is terrifying enough. It is a cautionary tale, though. And I came out of an extreme version of it.
Yeah, you sure did. Well, in your introduction, you write about shame. You say that the threat of shaming is the most ancient and biblical way to keep people in their place. And then you distinguish between guilt and shame, crediting Brene Brown as having said, guilt is I did something bad. Shame is I am bad. This is a super helpful distinction, because these are two emotions that memoirists are circling the whole time they write, I think, and certainly after they publish. And yet we see more and more memoirs coming out and we see people taking that risk. So I just wanted to ask you, why do you think that is? And what is this human impulse to grapple with shame and guilt and then put it out there for others to see?
I think that shame shame is a tool. Shame is a device that, as certainly Brene Brown said what she said, and that clarified everything for me. So much wisdom there. Is that's sort of one of the things that you tack on your bulletin board above your computer just when you're running, just to keep yourself aligned with, do I feel guilty about writing this, or do I feel shamed? Will I be shamed for writing this? And those are there's a very big distinction, as she said, and as I wrote. Storytelling, personal storytelling, is as old as writing itself. It's as old as oral storytelling. The oral traditions, which likely predate written traditions. There's a wonderful naturalist / memoirist, brilliant writer, one of my favorites. He's like the Donny Osmond of my current life right now, named Robert McFarlane. And he wrote this brilliant book called Underland. And he is a scientist. He's an ecologist, environmentalist. And in that book, he talks about, the caves. And 10,000 years ago, someone walked into a cave 10,000 years ago, took a mouthful of ochre dust, held their hand up to the cave wall and blew out the ochre dust and left a handprint on the wall. And that basically translated to, this is my story. I was here. Remember me. So, this is a very human instinct. This is a very human impulse. And I think that it is only becoming more so. It's becoming much more, as as a publisher, we go in and out of trends and I remember the trends where everybody loved to hate memoir. That was like all publishers were like, oh, it's dead, and I never, even as a former publisher, I never believed that. There are certainly trends in the publishing business, but there are not trends in what we write and how we write. And I think that we are where we are right now, and we're seeing so many memoirs, and we're seeing so much personal essay and so many hybrid memoirs and autofiction and all of, these kinds of things, because we live in a world right now that is so noisy and is so distracting. And, we wake up in the morning, and if you're like me and you have a tiny, tiny phone addiction, you look at Instagram or even Substack, which I think is a spectacular platform. I love it. If I didn't love it, I wouldn't be there. And some of the most extraordinary writers I've ever read, new, seasoned, are there. I just started reading Jeanette Winterson there, and that's, amazing. But I think that we are so distracted. We go onto Instagram in the morning, and what are we doing? We're scrolling. We're reading other people's stories. That's what we're doing. And they're fascinating. We do not want to feel isolated, distracted. We don't want to feel alone. We want to hear other people's stories. We want other people to hear our stories. This is the leveling of the playing field. This is what makes us human. And we are at a point now where we are at a great risk of being so isolated. We walk into our houses, we close the door, we live with this thing, which is both a blessing and a curse, rather than being able to sit down around, I used to call it the modern tribal fire, sitting down and talking to other people about our experience and hearing their experience. All of memoir is a humanizing practice. It allowed me to read the work. I had a student who was here now, who escaped Iran during the revolution in 1979 with her family. That is not my experience. That is not my personal experience. But I am there with her, and I am weeping with her, and I am experiencing the terror and the trauma and the joy and the grace of being able to leave, but also the heartbreak of that, leaving your home. I mean, we're seeing this everywhere now, people leaving their homes. And so now more than ever, it feels that much more important. And I think that people understand that, and we gravitate to it for that reason.
Well, Elissa, I want to ask you about the nature of traumatic memory, and that is one of the great kind of humanizing practices of memoir, I think. And your father's core memory of his mother's leaving shaped his life and yours. But you also share this story in the book about something your father says to you when you tell him you want to go for your MFA. And you unfold the scene by telling us exactly what you were wearing, item by item, and exactly where you were sitting, and what the place looked like and felt like. And this was really powerful because it just shows how time stops when we experience something deeply traumatic. And so from your experience as both a writer and a teacher, what have you learned about traumatic memories and how we write trauma, or should think about writing trauma?
That's a great question. And I was just speaking about this actually yesterday, as I think we see trauma in snapshots. I think we see them in frames. In the way that, movie makers see scenes in frames. And I don't know, I'm certainly not a therapist, but I don't know if that's a neurological function, if it's the way the brain metabolizes trauma. In my life, I've had a lot of different experiences that would fall into the category of traumatic experience. Certainly the experience that you're talking about, Grant, was shocking to me. And anyone who reads the book will, I think there's a gasp that kind of happens, because my father and I were very, very close. I would have called him my best friend for many years. And when I think back to him, I still refer to him that way. He was generally very creatively supportive, but I also know that he was a failed poet. And this is not to say that people who do not succeed at the work or they're not able to creatively fulfill their work say the kinds of things that he said to me. But I realized that, whether it's talking about him or talking about my mother in Motherland, time stops, as you say, time stops. And it's almost, I think, a protective device that happens to us, where we suddenly smell the perfume the person was wearing. We suddenly feel the carpeting. Mary Carr wrote about this in the first couple of pages of Liars Club. But when we talk about trauma, when we write about trauma in memoir, and this is something that I tell my students all the time, we have to be careful to not re-traumatize ourselves. And that's and it's different for everybody. It's different. How we protect against that is different from everybody. But the way I did it and continue to do it, and will probably do it again if I'm in that position, is I take a giant step back and I think of the narrator, myself, but not myself, telling the story. And I look down into what is effectively a diorama of experience, of situation. And I'm looking into this this sort of static scene, the way a filmmaker might look down into a static scene and set the stage and set the scene. And I came to that naturally. I came to that. I remember years ago, I was studying with Charlie D'Ambrosio, the wonderful essayist and short story writer. And he was talking about this. And I thought, okay, so this is definitely a thing for memoirists. We take a giant step back and we look at our narrators, at characters who represent us, but aren't us. And by doing that, we kind of create a padding, a safe zone, a demilitarized zone that allows us to see what's going on and to write about it from that slight step back. I think Vivian Gornick talked about that as well in The Situation in the Story, which is, I would have tattoos of quotes from Vivian Gornick all over my arms if I could, but my arms aren't that long. And in doing that, that has enabled me to write about things that have been devastating to me, but that are also incredibly important to the story. They're not just there; they have to be at the core of the story. Trauma, writing trauma for the sake of shock or any of those things is, I think it's valid and it's a valid instinct, but it's not what good memoir is made of.
Well, you're practically teeing up my next question, Elissa. So I'm going to go right into it because I wanted to ask you about excising these 40 pages that you wrote,
yes.
and you said literally that in the book. You said, look, they were valid, but your editor said, no, these have to go because you were essentially writing about this person who had wronged you and your editor kind of called you out. I appreciate your generosity, in processing that because obviously you're a memoir teacher. I am too. I edit people. And sometimes I'm just like, what is this? It has to go. So how can writers learn to be more discerning? Or do you think that we all just need to find great editors or coaches to help us see sometimes what those boundaries are?
That's a great question. I think that it is, again, it's human nature to want to sort of vent our spleen. And if you were in my office with me right now, you would see stacks of journals everywhere. And I think that journals serve an extraordinarily important purpose for people who are writing their way through the telling of a difficult story. And I think it's Ruth Ozeki, who was the first person I heard about who kept a process journal. And I know Danny Shapiro talks about it. And I think that the purpose of that is to help us in the creative process metabolize what should be in the pages and what shouldn't be. I was still in a state of rage over the things that had happened to me at the hands of someone in particular who was at the core of the story in Permission. And I was enraged. There's no other way to describe it. And so when I sat down to write one of my memoirs, I wrote and I wrote and I wrote, and I was writing in circles. And I wasn't able to get out of the circle. I was not able to move the story forward. And I think it's a function of having a wonderful editor, being blessed with a wonderful editor. And that editor for me was Lee Haber, who, a lot of people know who Lee Haber is, but she's great. Brilliant, great. And so I wrote these 40 pages. I thought they were brilliant. I thought they were smart. I thought that they did all of the things that they needed to do. And as you say, I sent them off to her and she said that, I'm looking at great manuscript, but these 40 pages have to come out because they do not move the story forward. They do not take the story into its next place. So, had I not had Lee in my court, I probably would say that the passage of time, writing whatever one needs to write, and then taking a giant step back and letting it sit, whether we all hear about people writing whatever they need to write and then putting it in a drawer and then coming back to it, later, whether it's days or weeks or months or, in some cases years, which that's a whole other story. context, distance, having moved forward from the trauma ourselves and being able to look at it in hindsight, that helps. Also, we have to ask ourselves, what is our intent? What is our motivation for telling the story? And, one of the things that I talk about a lot in Permission is asking ourselves that question. Why are we writing this? What is motivating us to tell the story? I also feel, and I don't usually talk about, writing early on, writing early drafts with the reader in mind. I talk about crafting the best thing that we can craft. But at a certain point, we have to ask ourselves, is it fair to ask the reader to sort of schlep through the quicksand of the poison of someone else's experience? Is it fair to ask them to walk through and get stuck in the quicksand of someone else's experience? And I don't know that it is. The other issue with knowing that something has to come out, that something has to be excised, is the fact that it's not moving the story forward. When we write those kinds of things, we generally write in circles. We go around and around and around and around, and then either the section ends or the chapter ends, and it's like a jump cut. And I know I'm speaking a lot in film terms here. It's like a jump cut. We don't naturally see what's coming next, and then the reader kind of looks at it and says, well, why did I just have to go through that? Why did I have to go through that? Why is this writer so bitter? And then it creates a certain level of distrust. And we always have to bear that in mind.
Well, Elissa, you write in the book about not measuring the impact of your work on others early on, and you also say something, too, about not putting the cart before the horse. So I was wondering if in closing you can say more about how you talk to new memoirists about holding the cart and holding the horses, too, and what are some good ways for writers to kind of stay in their process without getting way out over their proverbial skis with their future tripping.
I love that expression. Don't get out over your skis. That's wonderful. One of the things that I hear a lot, and Brooke, I'm sure you hear this all the time too, is, when a student comes to you and says, I'm so worried about this and I don't know what I'm going to do about that. And I'm really concerned that how this person's going to respond. And, what about an agent? And you've always also, I'm sure, heard about the ever popular, how do I get an agent question, right? And when that happens, I always say to the student gently as I can, well, how much of the work do you have? And 90% of the time they'll say, oh, I haven't started writing it yet, or I have 30 pages of it. And when they think, and, again, this is human nature. I've certainly done it too. And I know many writers who have done it. When we start to think so far ahead, we think about what the book is going to look like, what the response is going to be. Is my mother going to come back from the grave and, in the middle of the night and sort of throttle me for telling this story that's so important to me? And what that does is it stops the creative process in its tracks. It drops an anchor and it forces the writer to just fret and chew on their fingers and not think about the story itself and not think about the beauty of the story and the texture of the story and the rhythm and the sound and the pacing and all of those things that have to be considered in the craft of memoir, in the craft of anything. And, we live in a world now where I don't know how many hundreds of thousands of books are published every single year. You would know the answer to that. And it becomes this sort of like almost competitive instinct that we have. I want my students and I want readers to sit with the craft and to stay in the work itself. What does it sound like? What does it feel like? What does it smell like? I feel like, good writing takes on its own persona. You can hear it, you can feel it. It has a tactile sensibility to it. All of those things get shelved, get overshadowed when we put the cart before the horse before the car. I'm like, wait a minute, what I have to like visualize that. But the best thing that students, that new writers can do when they find themselves in that position is, number one, be aware of it. And number two, take whatever workshops that you can, step into a writing community with supportive other writers who are supportive. And and I always say that that kindness and creative analysis are not mutually exclusive. So I'm not one of those people who leads really sort of tough, acrimonious workshops. I don't believe that creates a better creative space for people, especially for new writers. But there is something really extraordinary that happens when you've got 12 people sitting around a table, and they're there for a week or 2 weeks, and they become each other's creative family. Obviously, it doesn't happen all the time, but it happens a lot. Maybe I've just been blessed, but it happens a lot. And they are all there to keep each other honest. And I'm there to help do that as well. And that's really, really important. But again, it's a motivation and intent question. Are we writing this because this is something that we have to write, that we are pulled to the page, that we're compelled, story that we are compelled to craft? Or is there something else going on, born of whatever else, whether it's competition or revenge or retribution or any of those things? But we have to slow it down. We have to pull the anchor up, and we have to understand that the process is what creates great work and great storytelling. And again, it's rhythm, it's sound, it's texture, it's color, it's all of those things. It's not only the way we tell the story, but it's not just the story itself, but it is the manner in which the story is told that goes into creating a wonderful story, and that will have legs and will live for a long time. Hopefully for me, long after I'm gone. I want people to be, reading my work and reading the work of the other people who have meant so much to me. And that comes with not getting out over your skis. I love that expression. That's so wonderful.
I think it's a very Canadian expression, or a very, Northeastern expression. Yes. I love it too. So thank you, Elissa. Thanks for being on with us.
Thank you. It was great to talk to both of you.
Thanks so much, Elissa.
Thank you.
We'll be right back with today's Substackin'.
Brooke, since we've been talking about the topic of shame this week, I wanted to go further with it because it's one that comes up a lot for writers. And I dug through my own Substack to see what I'd written over the years. And I came across one post that featured Brene Brown, which Elissa talks about as well, a different quote from Brene. But I'm actually hesitant to mention it because I once quoted Brene Brown and received an online comment from someone who said, "You writers quote Brene Brown too much," or something like that. And I felt kind of... I quote her a lot, but then she's researched shame and spoken about it widely and insightfully, and what she says has resonated a lot with me. So I like to revisit what she said and remind myself of it. So here's the main quote from my piece. Brene Brown says that we're meaning-making machines, which I agree with, and that's where the meaning-making that we do is through our stories. And this is the quote. She says, "Most of us have stories that make up our lives and tell us who we are and how we see the world. But we orphan a number of these stories because they don't fit with who we think we're supposed to be. But the problem is that our worthiness, our wholeness lives inside those stories. So you either own a story or you stand outside of it and you hustle and you pretend for your worthiness. When you deny a story, it defines you. When you own a story, you get to write the ending." And Brooke, I think this phrase that we often write toward the self, who we think we're supposed to be is important. To write about things that feel shameful, we have to write toward another self and kind of make that self in the writing. So what do you make of that idea?
No, I love it so much. And I especially like that notion you get to write the ending, and I think that's what a lot of memoirists are drawn to. It speaks to this notion of reclaiming too that we've been talking about quite a lot ever since we had Amanda Knox on the show. Not everyone, but many writers are writing to reclaim their stories, and perhaps to write their endings. And it seems to me that Elissa Altman wrote her earlier memoirs in part for that reason, to reclaim, to reframe. Many writers, her included, I'm sure, share their stories to release shame. And to say, you know what, this isn't mine to hold anymore. I'm making it public. And then if you get some pushback, you have to decide, okay, am I going to wallow in shame around this even more? Or am I going to keep going and keep reclaiming and setting the parameters of my own story and my own truth? So in this way, yes, I totally think we are always writing toward taking ownership of our story. And inevitably, that's going to entail writing, like you said, toward another self, perhaps.
Yeah, I often say that you can measure the progress of a civilization, the soul of a civilization, by the stories it allows to be told, or to even go one step further, by the stories it encourages. And I think that the same goes for each of us personally. We have to ask ourselves if we're telling our stories with our full heart, as Brene Brown might put it, and with courage. And on that note, I want to recommend a Substack where the author is taking those risks to write about a very traumatic childhood. I encountered this Substack after/words randomly, and the author Jessie Easton, she subscribed to my Substack, and sometimes I click over and see what my subscribers write, and I was quite taken by her Substack. She's grappling with all the topics we've talked about today in really compelling ways, and here are, for instance, are the first words of her about page, just to give you an idea of what she's writing. She says, "I'm Jessie. I grew up in the Mojave Desert in a meth lab on the edge of nowhere, and writing saved my life. I write about the things we're not supposed to talk about. It's not always pretty, but it's always real." And she delivers on that introduction. So I recommend that people read her Substack. She's also doing something really interesting with Substack by serializing her memoir with new chapters each week and building a readership around it.
Awesome. Yeah, we'll put her Substack in the show notes for sure. And I appreciate you bringing that to our attention, because sometimes we end up mentioning the Substacks that are super popular by renowned writers, who have 500,000 subscribers or whatever you want to say. Jessie has 2,000 or more than 2,000, but it's a good following. But, sometimes it's hard to find out about these Substacks that really merit more attention. And so I'm excited to start reading hers. And just to read a little bit more, she wrote, it's about how my mom robbed over 300 houses, how my dad built a meth lab in our home, how the other kids at school looked at me like my life might rub off on them, how the desert almost swallowed my family whole, how my mother shared a prison cell with a member of the Manson cult, how our home was filled with addicts who drifted in and out like ghosts, and how love and chaos were always knotted together, impossible to entangle. Really beautiful writing. And other than her story, she's also writing a lot about writing. And so it's a perfect Substack, and we're giving it a shout out.
Yeah, she writes about shame and permission in many ways, and I hope our listeners do check her out. And I hope you keep tuning into Memoir Nation, because these are the topics we're going to address every week, because writing a memoir goes so far beyond the craft of writing and storytelling. It's about the craft of knowing yourself and exploring yourself and expressing yourself and healing yourself and much more. Also, now that we're more than a month into our rebrand, we want to let you know that subscribers to Memoir Nation can see bonus content from every show. So we're doing 2 bonus video questions for every guest, and they're really fun. So if you love a particular guest, it's a great add-on and inspiration for your week. So please check out that opportunity at memoirnation.com and tune in next week for another episode of Memoir Nation.